Using this diagram, which gives us a pretty good overview of the digestive system, we can take a quick look at the breakdown of food, so the different enzymes that help break down the food. And then we're also going to look briefly at how it's absorbed, which mainly happens in the small intestine. So, starting up here in the mouth and the salivary glands, there's an enzyme that gets secreted by the salivary glands called amylase. And so if we sort of look at a close-up of a cell, now this part's not strictly assessed, but I think it helps just a little bit with the understanding. So if this is a salivary cell, we've got this is the DNA here, we've got a gene that codes for amylase. And so those cells in the mouth are constantly making copies of that gene into RNA, and then the RNA comes down to the ribosome here, which reads it and then constructs the enzyme amylase. So we've got the gene for amylase, which encodes the instructions, and then that gets built, and then we have our actual enzyme here, amylase. And actually, you can see here, this is a better look at the actual structure of amylase, the protein amylase. And actually, we can see on this page here, it just tells us that gene we're looking at, it's actually on chromosome 1, because the human genome's all mapped out. So the amylase gene lives on chromosome 1. Okay, so back here, what happens is the amylase, the salivary glands secrete it. It comes out of the cells and into the mouth. And if we've eaten some carbohydrate, so this diagram here is a carbohydrate or some starch. And we can see it's made of these repeating units, in this case, repeating units of glucose. So the job of the amylase is just to come along and break these bonds and break this down into individual units of glucose, in this case, which can then be absorbed. Okay, so that's what's happening in the mouth with amylase and carbohydrates. In the stomach, similar thing happens, except often it's the breakdown of proteins, and one of the enzymes that does that is pepsin. Exact same thing, and in fact, we can look here. Here's the structure, the enzyme structure or protein structure of a pepsin. And if we look at the gene as well, we can see actually the gene for pepsin is on chromosome 11. So all the cells in the stomach, not all of them, but some of the cells in the stomach are producing pepsin, and that's what's going on to build those pepsin enzymes. And then we have these organs like the liver, the gallbladder, and pancreas, which also secrete enzymes or substances that can help break down carbohydrates and fats and proteins. And one example is the pancreas secretes an enzyme called lipase, which is for breaking down lipids or fats. And actually, this is a protein structure of a lipase secreted by the pancreas. This actually gets secreted in just out of the pancreas and into the top of the small intestine, and it helps break down fats. And actually, if we look here, we can see that this pancreatic lipase, the gene for that is located on chromosome 15. And again, this part's not assessed, it's more just for interest, that there is quite a lot known about these proteins and the genes that code for them as well. So, okay, all right, so let's, so we have the breakdown. So we've got amylase, we've got pepsin, which is a protease, which breaks down proteins. And then we've got lipases, which break down lipids or fats. Okay, so let's go down, and we're going to do a sort of a close-up here of maybe a cell or an area of the small intestine. And what this picture shows is actually, so this is a capillary with some blood flowing across, and we're just going to look at how these nutrients are sort of absorbed. So we've got here, here's an amylase breaking down a carbohydrate into units of glucose. And so once they're broken down into glucose, so again, sorry, this space down here is the small intestine, and again, this is a capillary above. Glucose gets so-called actively transported into the capillary, and these active transporters require energy input, so ATP. And Actually, a lot of the ATP we use goes into this active transport of different substances in and out of cells. Okay, so that's carbohydrates. Then moving along, at the same time, we'd have proteins, so they'd be broken down by proteases, and we looked at pepsin. So proteins get broken down into individual amino acids, and then these amino acids can get actively transported, so they'd go up and into the capillary and taken around the body to where they need it. And then, lastly, we've got lipids, or fats, as they're commonly known, which are made of glycerol and fatty acid units. And so the lipase breaks those down. And then these ones, they can just go across. They don't actually need to be actively transported. They can just diffuse across. So that's sort of a close-up of the small intestine. And it's the small intestine where most of the absorption of those things happens. And then we've got enzymes like amylase, and then enzymes like, so the amylase breaks down carbohydrates, and then the pepsin breaking down proteins, and the lipase breaking down lipids. And that all occurs, and then the small intestine absorbs them. And there is still a bit of enzyme activity breaking down these things still in the small intestine, but it does begin, especially with proteins and carbohydrates, a bit before it reaches the small intestine. And a lot of that is sort of summarized in this table. Just to explain this, so there's the amylases, the proteases, and the lipases. Amylases break down carbohydrates. An example is amylase. The substrate, starch, is just an example of a carbohydrate. Product here, so we've been talking about glucose, but maltose, you could interchange where we've got glucose here with individual units of maltose as well. They're just a different kind of sugar as well. So this could be a maltose. In this case, I use glucose, but same process. And a lot of that happens in the mouth. And then if we look at the proteases, they break down proteins. So we've been talking about pepsin. Another example is one called trypsin. It's just another example of an enzyme that breaks down proteins. So we have multiple ones. So again, we talked about pepsin, but trypsin's another one. And they break down polypeptides, which is really just another name for proteins. They turn them into amino acids. And this is going on, trypsin's released in the small intestine mostly. If it was pepsin, the source of that is more the stomach here. Each of these, there are several varieties of enzymes. So we just want to look at the overall picture. And then lipases break down lipids, fats. So they're often secreted, lipases, pancreatic lipase is secreted by the pancreas. Triglycerides is a fancy name for fats or lipids. They get broken down to these fatty acid and glycerol units, and then they can be absorbed. And the source of the lipase is the pancreas, like we just mentioned. So hopefully that helps explain a bit more about what's going on with digestion, especially the way enzymes work and the way the actual uptake happens in the small intestine. The large intestine does some absorbing, mainly of water and minerals though, so most of the action happens in the small intestine. And on its way to the small intestine, it's really just about the breakdown of those so-called macromolecules, which are the carbohydrate, protein, and lipids, into their smaller units so that they can be then absorbed in the small intestine.